Hey, welcome everybody.
They're on.
Welcome. We are going to get started a little bit late, but thank you for your patience. So we'll call this meeting to order. We just need a vote to adopt the agenda.
So moved. Second.
Okay, a motion and a second. There, that's my very white. Motion and second to adopt the agenda. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Passes. Okay. Ms. Bowie, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. We're going to get started with, thank you, our interim finance director, who's going to set up Karen's presentation.
Thank you. Is this on? Is this on? All right, I won't stand right at it, but that's okay. Good afternoon, I'm Diane Wilson, the interim finance director. Good on the volume? Okay. As you will all recall, in the past, we have met with each of the commissioners individually as from budget to talk about your list of priorities. And this year, we met with all the commissioners with strategic initiatives and budget together. And we went through the new process that we were starting this year. We thought it made more sense. We started with our strategy, and then we moved into budget instead of the other way around. If you'll recall, we had several meetings, strategic initiatives held with you. I think there were 3 or 4 altogether, and talked about the strategic priorities. When we come back at the next meeting on May 7th, our next budget meeting, strategic initiatives will open up that meeting with a discussion of the outcomes from that meeting, operations to support your priorities that you had identified, and what additional items we may be able to do and what gaps are in place. So today we're not going to talk about anything new or commission additions at this point. Today we're strictly going to talk about general fund. So we're not going to talk about the other funds until later in May. So that would be enterprise funds like RTS and the other funds. Today is general fund. What we typically use is our major operating fund. And we also are only going to talk about the baseline budget. Should I carry it around? So, is that better? Patrick, can you hear me better now? Okay, thank you. So we're going to talk about just the baseline budget. So what we want to do, we feel it's very important to let the commission know where we stand financially to start with. So the baseline is basically the 2019 budget with no additions, no increments, no commissioner increments, no operating increments, no change to the GFT formula. It's business as usual, fiscal year 19 going forward. And then any items that we know we have to add, like living wage, pension costs, we've used our revenue assumptions, and Karen will address all those details during the presentation. But again, we just want to set, it's truly a baseline where we're starting. We also have included in that things that we know, so any additions from the commission since October 1st, like the inmate labor crew that was approved last week, so we've included that in the baseline going forward in 20 and 21 because we know that's a policy now. As we get into the presentation, you will see that we are starting out in a deficit. So again, starting with baseline, nothing new, we're already at more than $3 million deficit. That does not include an adjustment to GFT. So we really need to identify before the day is over what levers the commission would like to use to fill that gap so that we can start the next meeting talking about increments, additions, changes, kind of from a clean slate. So we're starting from zero. So again, the important thing at the end of this meeting, for us to be able to meet our statutory deadlines and to be able to give you good information at each of the upcoming meetings, we really need to get direction on how you want to balance baseline and what you would like to do about GFT. So if you are, desiring to change the GFT, to what extent, and then we will incorporate that in the next set of numbers that we bring to you on the 7th. And again, today we'd like to get that baseline balance to zero. So Karen will go through a number of options, where we are, what's included, so that you have all the information you need to make a decision on where you want to head from here. And then again, when we get to the 7th is when we'll start adding on if needed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shorter.
Good afternoon, Karen Fiore, Budget Manager. We're good on sound? Sound check. So we started our budget workshops back in February, as you recall, discussing our general fund transfer. Then we went in March, we had the conversation around our 5-year recommended CIP. Today, again, as Diane mentioned, we are going to focus on the general fund baseline budget for fiscal year 20 and 21's plan. During the February meeting, there were some requests from the commission, one specifically for what we pay to other outside agencies, as well as any potential surplus land from the city. We'll discuss those briefly. We'll discuss the uncertainties, as well as our baseline assumptions, and what budgetary levers do we have to balance the budget. Again, we're going to review the general fund baseline for 20 and 21. Again, the ask from you today is what levers are you comfortable using to balance the baseline budget? So the first item you requested back in February was the payments to outside agency. So here you can see for fiscal year 19, we contributed over $4 million to outside agencies. This is not all general fund contribution. A large portion of this comes from CDBG grant and home grant funding that we pass through to other agencies. In your backup, you have a complete list of these agencies by department, the agency name, the amount, and by department, like I mentioned. And here on this slide, you see it rolled up by category. So for outside agency grants, we provided about $57,000. The Professional Arts Producing Institute, the PAPI grants, we had $171,000 for fiscal year 19, and as you recall, in fiscal year 19, you adopted to double this contribution. It's usually around $85,000, so it went up to $171,000. The Special Events Additional Support for around $45,000. We have direct sponsorship to other agencies, around $500,000. The interlocal agreement contracts. This, your largest one, is the contract for the Grace Marketplace. We have payments on behalf of other agencies. So our fire assessment fee, we pay on behalf of
Nonprofit.
I know, thanks. Nonprofits and churches. And again, the grants through the Community Development Grant and the Home for 1.2. Again, the full list is in your backup. And the big question here is, do these agencies that we are supporting still align with your strategic goals? This could actually be a good budgetary lever to use during the fiscal year 20 budget process. The second request was to review potential surplus land. So city-owned land, these are not yet surplus. So staff identified 37 parcels for 5.39 acres. That full list is also provided in your backup. It also includes the actual parcel number for these parcels that you can investigate further. This also could be a good budgetary lever to use in the future. Not necessarily for fiscal year 20 because we don't have the value of these parcels yet, as well as the timing of the sale. Here's a map of those parcels. Again, that is also in your backup that you can review in more detail. Again, need to stress this is not a complete list of city property. This is just some that the city staff has identified. So what are our uncertainties? As mentioned in February, it's still very early in the budget process. The actuary will provide our employer pension contribution sometime in May. Can you move this? Yep, I just realized it as well. The property appraiser will provide the estimated truth and millage starting on June 1st. We'll get the final in July, on July 1st. And we're still vetting through our critical departmental increments. When we asked our departments to submit their increments for fiscal year 20 and 21, we started at about a $4 million request from our departments. Since then, leadership and staff has narrowed that increment list down to critical increments of about $1.2 million. And these increments will continue at the same service level as well as identifying the needs to meet our strategic goals. Again, these are not in our baselines. These are some uncertainties still. We're still vetting through these increments. Some unknowns, the total rewards implementation, what methodology and cost will that be? The trunk radio system. So here, we don't yet know the billing structure of the trunk radios. this is shared between multiple agencies. The GRU actually owns this, so we're not sure yet on the billing. What levers are you, again, willing to use to balance the baseline budget? And we had.
Please pause for a question.
Oh, sure.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. When is that contract supposed to be? Is that 2021 or is that Trump Radio?
It's the Trump 2020.
2020.
Yeah. And then the GFT conversation we had in February, we did not get specific direction on if there will be a cut or if we will continue at the same level. So as Diane mentioned, we're starting off our general fund baseline budget in a deficit of $3.3 million for fiscal year 20 and $2.2 million for fiscal year 21. Again, the baseline does not include any departmental crucial increments. It does not include any additional commission priorities. It does already include an increase for fees for service at 5%. It does include an increase to the fire assessment at 10%. And it does not include a change to the methodology for the general fund transfer. So we grew the general fund transfer at the fiscal year 19 rate of 1.5%. That is in your baseline currently. So under the personnel expenses baseline adjustments, we continue to increase our living wage. So fiscal year 20, we're increasing to $13.75. So that's about a $313,000 increase. Fiscal year 21, we're going to increase to $14.25 for almost $3,000. This also includes the compression associated with these increases. The total rewards will continue that. We have in our baseline $700,000 for fiscal year 20 and $600,000 for fiscal year 21. We have raises at 2% for both years, a little over $1 million. Our health insurance increased up to 8% for fiscal year 20 and 21. So this was an additional $975,000. As mentioned in the past, our pension rate, we are currently, we increased it to 22%, which is a 3.6% increase over fiscal year 19. This is our largest impact so far. And again, it's still early on. We won't know until early May. So it's a $2.2 million increase for 20 and a $2.4 million increase for 21. We've applied a vacancy savings for both years, a little over $1.3 million. Vacancy savings is determined by, depending on the number of FTEs, full-time employees per department. So the smaller departments may have a 1.5% vacancy factor, and the larger departments around 3%.
Yeah, good.
Mr. Mayor, on the pension rate increase 3.6%, you said earlier that the actuary table is coming back later in May. These are estimates then, is that correct?
Yes. So, and maybe Diane wants to talk more about this. So we were told that the state has recommended that we would increase this contribution, and we're waiting to find out the exact numbers. So internally, we determined it would be somewhere between 20 to 24 possible %. So we have this right now around 22%. So it could actually go up in May. Right now, we have it at 22%, which is a 3.6% increase over 19.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. I see that we have a vacancy savings at 1.5 to 3%, but what is that average vacancy rate across the city?
I would say probably closer to the 2% mark.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, good.
Okay, thank you. The baseline assumptions that you just went over, this is included in the expenses or not?
Yes,
Okay.
these are in the baseline that you just saw. So this graph shows all the personnel saving increases. This is not saying the total amount of budget. This is just the additional budget needed that we've included in our baseline. So the bottom bar, that purplish color bar, that represents your living wage and compression. Then the reddish bar is your total rewards. On top of that will be your raises. So for fiscal year 20, you see 2% as well as 2% fiscal year 21. Then moving the health insurance up to 8%, that's your black bar, it's about $975,000. And then that top green bar is your pension contribution increase for 2.2 increase in 20 and 2.4 increase in 21. This graph represents the adopted positions in the general fund starting in 2010. So what's important to note here, between 2010 and 2012, the bottom green bar, represents the non-public safety, and the top orangey bar is public safety, so that's your fire and your police. So between 2010 and 2012, we actually had a cut in non-public safety positions of 61 positions. Between 2010 and 2019, we actually added 61 public safety positions. Some other items I'd like to highlight here, in 2017, you see kind of like an increase there. Some items that took place here in fiscal year 19, adoption of the budget, we brought over 9 GRU HR positions into the general fund, and as well as adopting 4 new depot park positions, as you may recall. Then during the fiscal year 17, during that year, we brought over 5 IT positions from GRU. So those 5 positions were included in your adoption of your fiscal year 18 budget. Then during fiscal year 18 and 19, we really focused on fixing the house. So we actually added a little over 18 positions in fiscal year 18 and 24 positions in fiscal year 19. So that explains that bump. So you can see that in fiscal year 19, we're at the same level of non-public safety positions compared to 2010. That small little bit of a purple bar that represents 22 positions. Those are the positions due to the replacement of the Department of Corrections that you approved last week. These are the general fund portion. This graph is showing salaries and wages, no benefits, just strictly salaries and wages. You can see there's about a growth of 5%, so between fiscal year 19 and 20. So here you have your 2% raises as well as the additional FTEs. This graph now layers on the benefits. So for fiscal year 20, again, we have our pension and our health insurance increases, as well as the 2% that was already there with the wages. And this represents the increase in fiscal year 18 and 19 when we were fixing the house. You can see that bump for those 2 years there. This graph represents our employer and employee contributions for our health care. The bottom green, that is the employer contribution, and the top bar, the black bar, is the employee contribution. What's good to see here that over the last 10 years, we've been really steady at about a 70-30% ratio. 70% contribution from the employer with a 30% contribution from the employee. We did not include an inflation across the board on all of our operating expenses. There's only a few that we actually include in inflation, a very small amount for our fuel, a little bit of a bump for fiscal year 20, nothing for fiscal year 21. Utilities, we increased at 3% for both years, and you may note that fiscal year 20 seems like a much larger jump. For fiscal year 20, that is the year that we're bringing over Ironwood into the general fund, so that's the reason for that large increase there. We have an inflation factor of 1 to 3% for our fleet maintenance for both years, a 3 to 4% inflation for fleet replacement. And then during our discussion in March around our recommended 5-year CIP, we recommended a $6.6 million debt issuance for fiscal year 20. So we've included that principal and interest payment there for both years, as well as we talked about a potential $13.5 million debt issuance sometime around the year fiscal year 2021. We don't know at that timing yet, but we've included a partial interest payment in our baseline for that. And then there was the approval last week of those additional FTEs. So now looking at each of these items in a little bit more detail. Here you see the fuel trend. You can see that large drop in fiscal year 16. And the reason for this, it was the lowest national average actually since 2004. The average for 16 was $2.14 per gallon. And then in fiscal year 17, it bumped up to the average of $2.42. And then in fiscal year 18, it bumped up again to $2.72. And it's kind of been hovering ever since. We have a small inflation there. Our utilities, again, the steady growth of 3% here that you can see. Again, Ironwood coming into the general fund gave it a little bit more of a bump. And this graph is layering our fleet fixed and variable costs. And it kind of looks like a steep incline for the last 3 years. Again, fixed in our house. Historically, our fleet variable and fixed has been where we've been use it as a cut to balance our general fund budget each year. And we've been really trying hard to stay at the correct level to be able to continue our fleet fixed and variable. So we have in our baseline, again, a 1.3 growth for maintenance and 3 to 4% growth in replacement. One may ask why not just one specific percentage across the board. And here you have different departments have different uses on their equipment. Example, fire and police use their fleet at a very different rate than perhaps our city pool vehicles are used. So there's not a specific amount that you can apply across the board. Here we show our general fund debt service payments. So in fiscal year 20, we're recommending that $6.5 million debt issuance, and then that partial payment of interest in fiscal year 21. Taking a look at our revenues. So the large revenue sources for the general fund, of course, is our property tax, our utility tax, our communication sales tax, our service tax. We have intergovernmental revenue, which include state revenue sharing as well as half-cent sales tax. We have license and permits, such as our fire assessment fee, charges for services, and our general fund transfer. So this graph demonstrates how the city generates each dollar of revenue. Our largest comes from the property tax, our utility tax, and communication service tax of about 40 cents on the dollar. Then the general fund transfer, about 31 cents. Again, remember this, our baseline includes no reduction in the general fund transfer. Then we have about 12 cents comes from sales tax and state revenue sharing, followed by services, charges for services, and then the fire assessment and permit fees. We are being very conservative on the property tax this year. We get early on in the process. We won't know something better until June. So here we only have a small growth of about 2% for the property value. This very well can grow a lot fast once we get those June 1st numbers. So our trend in property tax revenue in fiscal year 18, you can see the bump, and 1.4 million was due to, we actually increased our millage rate. We were at 4.5079 and we increased to 4.7474. This brought about 1.8 million due to taxable property value increase, as well as about 0.6 million was generated due to new construction that year. We have a conservative 2% growth here.
Good.
A question on since we changed how the CRA is done, I guess this includes that increase that we may see since we're not doing a tip anymore, doing a set fee, and the University Park area saw a huge amount of increase. Is that being calculated into this, or how is that being?
From what I'm aware of with the CRA, our rates stay the same. The decline comes from what the county will contribute. So we are contributing at the same rate at the 4.7474.
We're paying a flat fee, it's not tied to millage anymore. I'm wondering, so I guess.
Right, but the dollar amount's not.
Yeah, does this, are we now going to count that extra, are we counting that millage into this now? That we were not counting, I guess we're not counting it.
No.
Because it's changing how the fees are doing, it's not it should just be a payment out of general fund now, not, right?
Right.
So when we receive that revenue, we historically would transfer it over. So our baseline budget the transfer is what was calculated with the CRA contract. So it would be in line with what the new contract is. Does that make sense? So my transfer over to the new CRA district that we have on, that we're having in our 20 books represent that true amount that's in that contract now.
I guess like the capture of the TIF, since it was capturing everything before, is that being, like 95% of it was being captured and put back into it. Now, there's no capture anymore.
Yeah,
And
it's
in
been
there?
adjusted with the transfer, yeah.
It's been adjusted within the
Yes.
contract?
Yes.
Thank you.
So here's a history of the millage rate. For fiscal year 18, we actually, like I mentioned, we increased our millage rate to 4.7474, and we continued with that same millage rate for fiscal year 19, which was actually less than the rollback rate for fiscal year 19. You can see that fiscal year 19 is still lower than fiscal year 2007, which was 4.8509. And then, of course, you can see the recession in 2008 when it hit, and we were, at that time, we went down to 4.2544. Looking at City of Gainesville compared to other cities across Florida, you can see that we're still not one of the highest in the millage rate. It's good to remember that the max is 10 mills per state, or per Florida, state of Florida, I should say. And so this graph shows how the city's millage rate accounts for 22% of the total taxable bill for our city residents. Number one being the Alachua County, followed by the school board, then us, then the library district, and Swanee Water Management District. Utility tax is generated through taxes levied on electric, gas, and water. It excludes fuel. And the trend of utility tax, you can see in fiscal year 19, we had an increase of about $2.7 million, and this was due to the purchase of the biomass. Once we purchased the biomass, the debt service at that time then became subject to this tax. Beforehand, it was not. So that was the increase, the $2.7 million. And then we have a small growth of 2%. Communication service tax, unfortunately, still is declining. We've been talking about this for the last 10 years. It's been declining. And the reason for this is the decline in landlines, as well as we have a high population of students here, and therefore the bill usually goes to their parents, which is not necessarily in the city of Gainesville, and therefore we're not collecting that revenue. So we have a 1% reduction applied to fiscal year 20 and 21. State revenue sharing, here we're pretty flat. You can see that like fiscal year 20 and 21, there's that little orangey layer, and that is the motor oil tax we actually designated to repay back the 1994 guaranteed entitlement refunding revenue bond. So that revenue is actually going directly to that fund and is paying off that bond, and that bond will be completely paid off in August of 2024, and that revenue will then come back to the general fund. So we're still collecting the same amount of revenue, but we've designated that to that specific fund to pay that debt. Here are the trend in half-cent sales tax. It's only been a slight uptick, about 1.5%. It's been pretty flat. So our fire assessment fee was implemented in 2011. It must be approved each year through a separate resolution. It was intended to cover 50% of the cost for fire services. Starting in fiscal year 2016, the city started to pay the fire assessment on behalf of religious and charitable organizations. At the time, it was about $120,000. It has since increased, obviously, each year. So fiscal year 2019, the current factor protection unit is $101. This now only covers about 45.3% 33% of the cost. This is about $6.7 million annually to the general fund. Our 20 baseline increases it to cover 50%, which moves it up to $112 per factor protection unit, which is a 10% increase, which is about $10 per FPU. This will now bring in about $7.4 million annually to the general fund. Again, the general fund transfer, looking at this, it's intended to serve as a proxy for what GRU would pay if it were an investor-owned utility. So it would pay for property tax, it would pay for the franchise fees, it would pay a return on investment to shareholders. Our baseline includes a 1.5% growth factor for fiscal year 20 and 29. So this slide shows again, we're starting our baseline deficit at $3.3 million, and I'll just stress again what this does not include. It does not include any of the critical increments that the departments have identified. It does not include any of your additional priorities around the strategic framework. It does include the increase for the fire, the increase for the fees for service at 5%, and it continues the general fund transfer at a growth of 1.5%. So what are some of the levers you have available to you to balance this baseline budget? In February, we brought to you a list in specific detail of each of these items. For personnel service related cuts, it was $953,000. I don't have the full list in all that backup to give you just the total amounts here. The program cuts about $145,000. Again, program cuts would have a service level impact. We have a fixed percentage that we can put across, we can apply across the board, a 1%, a 2%, even a 5%, which is roughly around $1 million. It's important to note that this is across the board, so this is public safety departments as well. So you have your fire and your police will be affected here. As well as we can do a hiring freeze. Today, if we did a hiring freeze for the general fund, it would be about a $6 million savings. That's a one-time savings. It's not a recommendation by any means. You have some key positions, obviously, that are vacant here. And it includes quite a bit of your fire and police positions that are vacant. And not listed here, but I thought of it later, you can also use as a lever reducing the contribution for the capital improvement plan that came in to you back in March. On the revenue side, some of the levers you have, you could increase the millage rate. To give you a couple examples, a 1 mil increase would be about $6.3 million increase. 2 mils, about $12.6 million. We can increase the fire assessment greater than the 50% increase that's already in the general fund baseline. If you went to 75%, it would bring in about $5.4 million more in revenue. You can increase the fees for service. Currently, in our baseline, we have the increase at 5%. We can possibly go to 10%. It will bring in roughly about $100,000. That one's hard to determine. So again, what are the levers that you're willing to utilize to help balance the baseline budget? As Diane mentioned, that during the next budget workshop, after Strategic Initiatives goes through their presentation showing what we're already doing to meet the strategic framework, we will then, as your direction from today, we will provide you with a recommended baseline budget, general fund budget, I should say, which will include the levers that you recommend using today. And if there's any additional general fund transfer discussion, it would be helpful to understand what those levers you're willing to use also to balance the budget. So our next steps, May 7th, like I mentioned, we'll have our next budget workshop, starting with strategic initiative, and we'll have continuation of the general fund discussion. Then on May 21st, we'll have the discussion around our other funds, and then the remainder of our commission meetings are listed.
Hey, thank you for that. I feel really loud. That's fine. I think you have some questions, Commissioner Warren.
Thank you, Mayor. So we can use a combination of expenses and revenues. If we were to, looking at the millage, if we just did a half a mil, that would be almost what we needed there, right?
Correct.
We've got several positions with hiring. Where did I see? I don't want to do a hiring freeze, but if there were some areas that were, a partial, because we look at individual spots, that would be more, some are more critical than others, I think. I definitely don't want to go into the fire and safety, the fire and the police department's budget, but I would want to get some feedback on a portion of some of these categories, such as a fixed percentage across all departments, maybe saying some of the departments, if we could do that without doing fire and safety. Fire and police, any of the safety personnel.
Sure, as soon as you start to exclude your larger departments, that savings becomes a lot smaller, just so you know.
Right.
Right.
But that's why I'm looking at a combination of different things that would allow us to get to that 3 mil.
Right, and if you gave leadership direction to go and find savings using a fixed percentage across the board, they can bring back that to you in the recommended budget. And if you specifically said not to include fire and police,
Well, to me, when I look at where we are with our millage, I'd like to avoid using the general fund transfer. And when I look at the history of where we've been on the millage, we're less than what we've been at other times. I forget what page that was. But those are the areas that I feel that we could, stay with the general fund transfer where it's been. And if there's any room to lower that, I'd just like to know what that would look like on the other areas, but I'd like to see what we could do with a small percentage reduction in other departments, and with consideration that there could be some positions that we wouldn't hire. I know that all adds up.
I was just, could you go to page 42? Just on that page. So
42 with the
Commissioner-
levers.
Yeah, so budgetary levers, so that first one, you see personal services related cuts at $953,000. So
Right.
when staff put together that wish list that we had pared down from a little more than 4 million to 1.2, we also, excluding public safety, asked our departments to look at positions that I can't say you need all of them, but if they weren't critical, to put them on that list. And so that's what that 953 represents. That already excludes.
But is that separate from the hiring freeze line 4 on that?
yes,
Because with the hiring freeze, how many positions would be in that line?
6 million,
That's everything.
Yeah.
that's everyone right to stay. I'm looking at, the total number? I don't have the exact FTE count, but that's today, stopping everything.
Yeah, and I don't want to stop everything. Again, I think that there are some positions that are really critical that we need to get filled. But if there's, again, say if there were 100 spots across the city, I have no idea of how many spots there are. But looking at a combination still thereof, which ones would, if there was a ranking system, and everybody's important, but if you don't have them hired yet, it's easier to not fill it than to have somebody let go. And I don't want to let go of individuals, but
Yeah.
if
So if we got the direction at a percent that you would like to see under the hiring freeze, then leadership could go back and identify those positions that they feel comfortable with freezing for a year or 2 years. We would need that recommendation as well, how long you want to freeze them. And
and
remember
what I'm
that this
saying
is
is
a
with the
one-time
expenses and the
savings.
revenue, if we split it, if we could reduce 1,500 or 1.7 million from expenses and 1.7 added to revenue with a millage. I mean, if we did, just a small fraction of millage increase, we could get 2 million there. If you're saying if we did one full millage, it would get us 6 million, well, what would we get if we had 0.25? We'd get almost 1.5 million there. So
Right,
again, I
and
see we can bring up our revenue and reduce our expenses.
Right, and that's the feedback we're looking for. So if you gave us that scenario that you want to see use of hiring freeze and millage, then when we come back to you on the 7th, we will give you a scenario showing those two factors split about half and half to cover the deficit.
And did this take in the ideas of, it did take in the total rewards and other, I tried to make a list throughout the year when we talk about something we want to add and how much that would be, but I didn't do the accounting of, where I put those slips of paper. Maybe I'll use the phone next time. But did you use in your planning those items that we've talked about, programs that we've wanted to add and those additional expenses, or is this just what we've done to continue that without adding anything new?
So the personnel savings increase, or personnel increases, let me go back to that slide. So, that's not it. Sorry. So this slide, so these are all the items that we included in our baseline. So you can see that we have total reward holding at 700,000, just a placeholder for fiscal year 20, and 600 for 21. I know that there's been a committee around the total rewards implementation and how they're going to strategize that for fiscal year 20 and moving on. So here we have these amounts in our baseline, but it may not necessarily be broken out this way once the total rewards is implemented. So it may be, all in a certain category, or I don't have the answer because that's kind of behind doors right now. So, but we knew that we had to continue to include these items to get to the results of the total rewards.
Okay, well, an example of one of the things that we want to do more of is an after-schools program out of the Parks and Recreation. Would the cost of that service, that program, have been included with the expenses?
No.
Okay.
No. So on May 7th, when Strategic Initiative comes back with what programs we're already doing for the strategic framework, that may be one of the items that we're already doing that you may say, yes, we're already doing enough perhaps in that category, just as an example, and that you do not want to add any additional funding to that program because you believe that we are doing enough in that area once you're able to see that. If not at that point, then the commission would say, no, I want to add XYZ to this priority of mine.
Yeah, so I would feel like I'd be better enabled to move forward with how to adjust the revenue and the expenses if we had that list here too, because that list of what we want to do is really important.
Right,
to
so this
our
is
budget
strictly
planning.
the baseline.
Yeah.
So
But then
anything
this is the
above,
baseline.
yeah, so we're already at a deficit for our baseline, so we have to fix that first. So we have $3 million we need to fix our baseline before we start adding our increments. As mentioned, we have not even added our departmental increments that we've deemed critical. So
Yeah.
those are not in here yet. So again, your priorities, additional, are not in here yet. So on the May 7th, once we show you a balanced baseline budget with the levers that you tell us to use today, so your example was use a little bit of a hiring freeze and use a little bit of a millage rate increase, we will get you to that balanced baseline budget. May 7th, anything above and beyond would be, another lever will be needed to balance that budget.
Yeah, and that's where I'm feeling like it'd be nice to have a side plate, knowing what's for dessert, so to speak, only it's another cut, maybe. Or
Right, so when we really tried this year with this budget cycle, working with Strategic Initiative, was to find out what we're already currently doing to meet your needs for your
Yeah.
strategic framework. So on May 7th, when we come to you showing what our departments are already doing, we may be fulfilling those needs already currently, or you may say, okay, don't focus on that anymore, move over to this. This is more important to us.
Yeah, I think that's the hard part of why this is always so challenging. And my concern is, once we go through an exercise of identifying what the baseline is, we're almost going to have to redo that, because if we see something that's really important on the supplemental list, I would think we'd have to go back and look at the baseline and say, what do we want to change there, and have this conversation again. Otherwise, we have to talk about where are we going to get the additional money, which either way you look at it, we have to look at where are we going to adjust the baseline. So I don't know why we don't have some element of that forecast, what's on the horizon. You guys have talked about these things in the last year. And we've got to see if that fits in with this others, because again, one of the big things that we've had the conversation about throughout the last year and a half has been, how are we going to address the disparity study and do something different? And I feel like that really needs to be a part of this conversation somehow.
I'm hearing you, and I do recall during the fiscal year 19 adoption of that budget, this conversation as well, and the hiring of the positions in the clerk's office. I know there was a conversation around when we come up with an additional priority, we're going to use those positions to help flush out what the program looks like before we start applying budget to all of these different priorities. So during the May 7th meeting, when you hear what the departments are already doing, if there's additional need under a certain priority, the use of those new employees can then determine the additional budget need, how much more funding, how many more personnel are needed for that program before we just start throwing budget to these additional priorities.
Well, then that's where I would come back and look at the millage rate as having a lot of resources available, anywhere between 0 to 1 mil. But that puts us to a point that, you know, we haven't been at this point before, so. Well, that would be my concern, is how we could, what it would look like if we did have an increase in the millage and not do the general fund transfer, keep that level.
So I just want to say if it's helpful to the conversation, because it's a lot to digest. So the baseline does not include the critical departmental increments that were referenced, started at a little bit more than 4 million, staff pared down to 1.2, and it doesn't include your commission priorities. So it doesn't include that. That's not in the baseline. What is in the baseline is an increase to services at fees for services at 5%, and then an increase to the fire assessment at its current rate by 10%. And the GFT that's in the baseline assumes no reduction and a 1.5% growth for each year over the next 2 fiscal years. So while you're thinking about that, know that by January 1 or by June 1, not January, June 1, we'll have preliminary figures on property values, and we'll know them by July 1. And you heard the reference to the pension rate, right? So we used an estimate, but really in May, it could be higher than 22%. So those are some unknowns. We were pretty conservative with the property values, but just as you think about what's in the baseline and what's not in it, none of the increments are in the baseline, right? So the $5.5 million deficit, 3.3 in FY20 and then 2.2 in FY21, closing that first before we even get into some of the other discussions about the increments. And I think your point's well taken. It's one that we wrestled with internally as the departments thought about their increments. We then had to go back and say we need down to the critical ones, but they're not included in the baseline because we still have to address those deficit numbers.
Well, one of the concerns that I've got going back to the general fund transfer is just a recognition that the more we do to increase conservation, the smaller the resources are for, you know, the income coming in to pay utility bills, because those are going down unless the numbers of individuals and households goes up. As those go up, property taxes, there's more homes that are available to feed into that too.
And again, early on, we still don't have our June 1st numbers, so it may be an exciting day on June 1st. We may find out, you know, wonderful news, and that may shrink the gap, which would be great.
Just from millage being on the normal market, increases may provide a big part of that. But we spend so much time talking about that. What is that other thing other than public works and public safety that we can do that'll help make the city great? And yet, if it's not part of the baseline discussion, we always come to this point then on an annual discussion of those extra things that are going to make Gainesville better and to take care of some problem that otherwise we've just kept kicking down the lane or just being complacent about and saying, well, you can't fix everything. There are some of those issues that we have got to find a way to pick up.
With getting the June 1st numbers, perhaps a scenario could be increase the millage just to fill in that gap. So it may not be a full half mil.
Right.
So once we get those numbers, we may only need a small fraction of that. That could be a scenario as a budget lever that you may want to recommend.
And I also wonder if we had more attention to paying towards our debt, how that would secure us down the road too. And just, you know, scheduling those payoffs. And that, of course, you need to have that extra money available to do that too. So I thank you very much, Mayor.
Thank you. Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. Earlier you read, can everybody hear me? Is this on?
Yeah. Speak up.
Okay, here we go. So you went over a list earlier of what is not included, and I just am catching like two of them. Can you go over that again?
Sure. Okay, so it does not include any of the critical departmental increments that we've identified.
Right.
It does not include any of your additional priorities that you may have identified. The things it does include is,
Oh, is that it? Just the two that's going to include? Okay, got
yeah.
that then. I thought you had a
Oh,
list
yeah,
earlier.
we did not include an inflation across the board on all of our operating. We just had a select, I can show you that slide. We only increased our utilities, a little bit on our fuel, our maintenance, replacement. Those are the only items that we added inflation factor to. So that's what it includes, but it does, yes.
Okay, gotcha, thanks. So you said across the board, across the 24 departments, then the critical increments presented were $4 million.
General fund, yes.
From the general fund. And then you, then there was $1.2 million that you kind of identified as the ones that were most needed. So how did you go about that process with the departments with deciding, you know, from 4 million to 1.2 million? And
So we met with the departments, the assistant city managers met with all of the departments and through several iterations with a lot of feedback from them and going back and saying, so really kind of coming up with that list of what's critical that needs to be done right now, which was a bit of work, right? Starting out with a little bit more than 4 million to get it down to 1.2. I can't say that everyone's obviously not happy about that, right? That's a tough conversation to have because I think if you got departments that know their departments well, and even if you saw the slide with where we are, I mean, in 10 years, we're not even where we were in terms of staffing. So to get that list down to the 1.2 means a lot of things that were really important and priority, we just had to structure them as like most critical.
okay.
That's pretty tough to do. You know, it's what, every time we get into a budget discussion, these are things that are important, but given kind of where we are, we really had to say to them, like, down to the most critical list.
Okay. And that was decided upon by you
management,
and the
yes.
departments. I'm going to agree with Commissioner Warren about addressing the disparity study and the inequity study that came out. I think that we are going to beyond the staff positions that have been allocated in the clerk's department to begin to address it in a more substantive way, because it's been at least 2 years since that study, and then if we put it off another year, then we're going into year 3, potentially into year 4. So, you know, that's something that I'd like to put on everybody's radar. I think it's going to be important to do that. In what ways? I have some ideas about that. But I think that it's going to take resources beyond what we have allocated in terms of staff at the moment. Yeah, those are all the thoughts that I have at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Santos.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One thing I think we need to realize that wasn't brought up, that in the GRU budgets that we've been getting, there's a $6 million difference in GFT. So in essence, there's a $6.6 million difference in the GFT between what's presented here and what's on GRU. On that note, I think we need to get back to millage. I mean, on the property assessments, the assessments that are not assessments, estimates are very conservative, I think, guys. It's almost staying flat, right?
There's a small 2% growth.
Small 2%. There's a lot of new stuff, and sales prices have been increasing. So I would expect we'll see a significant increase in
Yeah,
that
we
area.
historically do not budget that.
Yes, I know, yeah, I'm just saying, for us, I don't want us to make a decision, or even really, it's hard to talk about millage until we get those numbers, because we don't know how much half a mil is versus 1 mil.
Right.
It could be vary by millions of dollars. But on the GFT, I would like for us to put in at this point, in the baseline general government budget, just a flat GFT with no increase.
Based on fiscal year 19's number, flat?
Yes, yeah. I think that's $600,000 difference, or something like that.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
correct, 550.
As for some other items in the baseline budget, after cutting costs, I'd like for us to consider removing the fire service and special assessment that we pay. I don't think that's the best way to spend $164,000, is giving a blanket kind of covering for everyone. I think by pinpointing it and dealing with issues and talk about, like, there may be specific areas that we can take that money and spend it better. I think just giving everyone a blanket, kind of covering that cost, I don't think is the best way to deal with helping members of our community. One other thing I'd like for us to consider in the baseline, it's a small thing, is for us not to increase pool fees. I think that's one of the things that we should try to make sure that we have as many people as possible that use our pools, and that's a relatively small amount. I'm open to increasing the fire assessment somewhat, fire assessment fee percentage. I already spoke about millage. I think we need to get back to the June 1st numbers before we can. It's hard to have discussion too, because I think that it's going to be a significant increase. As far as a fixed percentage cut across our departments, I'm not comfortable with that. We're asking more out of our employees now. We're asking for more programs. We're asking for more things. We're taking on more things with the last baseball places. I don't see where we could cut and still do what we're saying we want to do. I think we may have to add things, but thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Commissioner Sims.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree somewhat to what Commissioner Hayes-Santo just stated, but before I piggyback off of him, I wanted to ask on the communications tax. I think it's on page 33. Yeah, the service tax. I know a lot of cities in the state are having issues with this particular tax, but they are being very aggressive in trying to go out and, I guess, reach out to Verizon and all these new cellular companies that have infiltrated our state. So I guess my question is, have we done anything like that? Have we reached out? Have we been aggressive in trying to communicate to these providers that we need our share of funding?
Yeah, what have you done historically the last couple of years?
I'm not aware of anything that we've historically done. I just know that we've been explaining the decline for the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I think that's something we need to start looking into, how other cities and communities have been going after their share, because I think this is a continuous problem throughout the state. A lot of municipalities are losing out on the service tax, so if we can start,
We read recently that some cities have started to tax on those
Yeah.
cellular ones.
mhm. So I think that's something we need to really look into.
I was asking about the Florida League of Municipalities to find out from some
Okay.
benchmark cities or some other cities what they're doing.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Also, and I'm looking at our backup, some of the organizations that receive funding from the city. And I wanted to know, what does the asterisk mean besides some of these organizations? 'Cause
Sure, so those are related to the PAPI grants, the professional arts producing institutions. And the asterisk, which I think is now eliminated from this document, we had a couple versions, represented that this was doubled in fiscal year 19. The commission requested to double this contribution, so it was around 85,000, it went up to 170 something for fiscal year.
So the organizations that have asterisks, the commission asked that the contribution be doubled?
For the PAPPYs, that's what happened with the PAPPYs.
Like on page 2, you have at the bottom, elder care on demand transportation with the asterisk programming support, asterisk shelter support services, asterisk.
I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to why they have the asterisk there. I think we were cutting and pasting from other documents, and it probably represented possibly a one-time funding at one time. I would have to email you when I get back to the office and let you know.
I'd like to know what that means. And, Early Learning Coalition of Alachua County, there's an asterisk, programming support, $65,000 that was donated. And also Early Learning Coalition subsidized child care working for families, $65,000 donated. I guess so my question is, when we have programs such as that and anything to do with Alachua County Schools, because of the new tax initiative that was passed, the Children's Trust and the one cent sales tax, can we look and see maybe that cover a portion of what we're providing? Can we, the Early Learning Coalition of Alachua County and things to do with school, with Alachua County School, because of the passing sales tax that was passed, I was wondering if any of that is on their list to cover what we're contributing to. Maybe we can find out from the county.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So we have some history on the asterisks.
Brett Murray, Assistant City Manager. Those asterisks were a number of years ago, they were actually included in the base budget as a part of our normal budget process. So then they got sort of locked in. The only thing we did is ask them to submit a letter every year just to remind us that they would be included. So $36,000 on the Uber, on the elderly care was again one of those things that came a couple of years ago. They came to commission and commission sort of included them in the base budget. And so every year they're included at that base amount of $36,000. Going back to the Early Learning Coalition, it's a grant. We give them the money, and they get a 2-to-1 match there and provide those services. Commissioner, as it relates to your question, whether or not they're included in the school board budget, I do not have that answer, but I know this is how some of that stuff has gotten added to the base budget over a number of years.
Okay. Thank you for that. And that's just something I would like was just to have that conversation with the school board. Even if it is, maybe we can contribute something, but maybe not as much. But certainly help out if we need to, but just take a look at that. Also, the millage, I would love to see those numbers when they come back from the property appraisal. And I would like for us to do an appraisal on the surplus property that we have, because you stated there hasn't been an appraisal done on the potential surplus properties. So I would like to have that come back at our next meeting.
I'm not sure if that would be doable for the May 7th meeting.
Oh, wait, I'm thinking June.
Oh, not sure if that's doable for June 1st.
Okay.
Fred, would that be something that the appraisal of the surplus properties by June?
I'm kind of stunned right now.
Okay, well, but if we can't have it done by June, at least let's start working on appraising the potential surplus properties. I would like to have that information.
The only thing that I would remind you is that these are not surplus properties right now. Only you can determine surplus properties. We have to come back to you to determine whether or not there have been our surplus properties, because we have a process, a procedure how it's done if you declare it a surplus property. What has usually happened in the past is that we come to you to determine whether or not the surplus property, and then we identify those properties working with nonprofit organizations. We try not to give away all of our surplus properties because we use that in some of our redevelopment efforts. And Commissioner, we will follow your direction and come back to you, but I can't guarantee that we'll have a full amount of appraised values of those properties.
And that's fine. I thought I heard earlier that all of our surplus property was not listed. So I was just speaking about the list that we have today, that this list.
I can tell you, we've got a number of properties that we've got easements, all of those types of things are not listed on that bit. But that's probably what we have there, are mostly residential lots
Okay.
within our community that we've identified. Because we've got easements that Public Works has, easement that GRU has, they're identified as city property, but we don't list them as all as surplus property, or because we still have some use for it. And some of the properties are on that list that you have right now. You will see that they're what we call escheated properties that give, we have a reverter clause on some of those properties.
Okay.
Until they fulfill their requirement, we don't actually give them the property until they actually start. And then we sort of have to issue a satisfaction lien on the second part of that.
Okay.
So Commissioner, I'll just add, because I know it's come up a few times, that we won't have the numbers or even the preliminary numbers by June 1st, and so finance is just asking really for more decision on philosophy so that they can prepare some scenarios. So even if we don't know what a millage increase will look like in terms of a half or a fraction of that, whether or not the commission is comfortable giving direction on a philosophy of whether we should look to some millage increase, knowing that we can firm up those numbers by June.
Okay, thank you. So to go back to Commissioner Hayes Santos, his comments, I like the idea of a flat GLT, not to increase in the next couple of years. Also, if you could, Mayor, allow Mr. Hayes Santos to explain the fire service, what you were saying. Can,
So in 2016, the commission started paying a fire assessment for, in essence, nonprofits and religious institutions. It's a blanket kind of covering them out of the general fund. I believe that's correct. Correct me if I'm right here.
Yes. 2011, we started,
2011 started,
2016
yeah.
is when we
In
started.
2016.
Yes.
I don't think giving a blanket kind of subsidy to every single one in the whole city is the best way to deal with it. I think that money could be used in a more pinpoint place to actually deal with real issues. We were talking about the disparity. I'd rather take it and put it into a more targeted approach, just giving a flat subsidy to all of the nonprofits in town.
I may be having a little history to that. It was also faith-based organizations that came to the commission and said they did not have the ability to pay because sometimes the fire assessment was more than what some of the churches could come up with. And so at that particular time, the commission decided, because they had seen enough of this, they said people kept coming and it became an issue. And they decided at the time to decide to pay that so that this would not be an issue. So I just want to let you the history behind that. And if you decide to revert back to that, I just want to get you that they're going to come back to you to ask about that fire assessment fee. I just want to let you know that.
and what year was that? 2016?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was a gathering of faith-based organizations citywide.
Okay.
So for 5 years, we'll pay.
Right. Okay. And so I agree with Commissioner Johnson and Helen Warren when we talk about the disparity and how we want to incorporate that as our framework and really look at what we can do to combat the disparity. But I'm interested in getting the numbers back from the appraisal, from the property appraisal's offices, take a look at that. We have been kind of even keel, kind of stagnant in that department. Also wanted to just no increase in the GFT, look at what we can do for the communications tax, how we can be more aggressive in that area. Look at some of these nonprofit organizations that are combined with the school board and see how the Children's Trust can combat some of the funding that we've been contributing to some of these programs, if at all, if it does cover any of that, just to take a look at. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, and I think I can add a little clarity on the children's issues. The half-cent tax that passes only for infrastructure, so we wouldn't be paying anything that would be covered by that. For the Children's Trust, that's through millage. Hey, got a little buddy down here. It's a little baby gator.
That's a lizard, not a bug.
So, I said buddy. They don't have a full board yet. They're waiting on their gubernatorial appointments. And so I think that they have had some preliminary high-level discussions about how they would direct those funds, but don't think they've made any sort of concrete decisions yet. I think they've only met once, in fact. So it would be I think it would be a valuable conversation to have, where they, even if it's a high level, where are they gonna align their priorities? I think they made some comments to the effect that they wanted to start slow and sort of be deliberate instead of trying to do everything at once. So I think it would be a good conversation for us to have, going both ways, that the city has certain priorities. And share our framework with them and share our commitment to the sort of socioeconomic and racial inequities that we're trying to address, and how can we sort of jointly leverage the resources that we have. But I don't think they're there yet.
Okay.
So I don't know if this budget cycle will be the one, but certainly after they get up and running and established and sort of have some structure to themselves, we definitely should have that conversation.
I agree.
Commissioner Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I agree on the Children's Services Council. They're probably not going to be too willing to trade off things, partially because they don't want it to be like the old lottery model where we passed the lottery and said this is going to be new education money, and what it did was replace other money. So I would be, if I were them, I would be reticent to want to make a deal like that. But we'll see. I mean, it's always worth asking. I'm really curious about what we might be able to do with the communication services tax. I had not considered that people aren't paying what they're supposed to pay, and if that's the case, we absolutely need to be collecting it aggressively. That's, if people are doing business in our city and not paying the tax, then that makes sense. That's where we ought to be looking. I think we're not able to make good decisions until we have the tax appraisers information, property appraisers information. As Commissioner Santos said, we could be looking at at least a six-figure addition and possibly a seven-figure addition, and that being the case, that's real money. And I don't want to frighten people with talk about millage increases if we don't have to do that, honestly. That's the last place I want to go with this. The second last place I want to go is a hiring freeze. I would rather not do that either. That doesn't, certainly don't want to freeze, won't freeze public safety positions. I'd rather not freeze anybody because again, we've been working with lower staff than, we're just now catching up to where we were a decade ago, and our population that we're serving has continued to increase. So it's essentially a net deficit there of people serving the people, staff serving the people. So we don't have all the information yet, so I want to be careful with that. I will say that at least we should not consider more than a flat GFT, and I may be interested in a lower GFT, but at the very least a flat GFT is what I'm looking at. So that's the most information I can give you for now. Sorry, I wish I could give you more, but without that, the property appraisers data and kind of stuff. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Warren.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm agreeing with the conversation about the Children's Trust. We've got two programs that are out there that we've been supporting, and I believe we can all agree that the Children's Trust is just going to enhance those services from the early learning to the parent empowerment process. I just want to make sure that we aren't in a conversation with them to see where we can enhance, or they'll be enhancing what we've got. Everything that I've seen about the Children's Trust is to make more of those services available. But I don't think we should be working in isolation with them, and I don't think we will. As I said, I just want to make sure that we have a conversation with the Early Trust Coalition. As for the continuum of care, this might be a question for Mr. Murray. When I'm looking at the different things that we've got, advisory boards, annual budget, one of the things that I don't see is a continuum of care, that we should be a member of that, and that maybe it's not on the annual budget dedicated to be part of the baseline discussion, or if it's a auxiliary fund that comes in beyond that. But I know I'm in a meeting that we talk annually about everybody, the membership, renewing their continuum of care membership. But do you know where that fund comes in?
Fred, before you start, if I can just say, the advisory boards, this is funding that the city provides to each of these boards, not, it's not memberships to different
Okay.
boards. Yeah, so these, so the.
There's a whole other category for that.
Yeah.
Okay.
The best way to answer that, Commissioner Mayor, is that we would probably have an individual membership probably out of our housing community development division. They would have the membership, and we would work on their membership as a part of the COC. I do not know right now whether or not we have a membership. If we do not, we will have one before the week's out, because it's something we will participate. We don't participate as an organization, but we will probably, well, I'm saying participate. COCs, again, gets federal funding. We will only participate as a member. And so I will find out. I'm looking at staff now down there. They're shaking their heads at me, so we will probably identify funding to be a member of the COC.
Okay, thank you very much. And then one last item, just going to that conversation with the fire assessment. I was on the commission when that all came up. And I remember the conversations that came to us. What I'm wondering is, we have another category for regular people out in the community to file as a hardship. Had we offered that to the churches also? Why did we, and do we have every church in the community that applies as is waivered, or is that a hardship basis that money is taken out of just those who apply for it?
So my understanding is that it applies to all of them. I don't think they make an application for the hardship.
Would that be an option that we could do based on hardship? So the churches who feel it.
Historically, it's been individuals that have to meet income thresholds. We haven't extended to businesses as entities. As far as the nonprofits and churches, it's done as a mechanism of the property appraiser's designation. So if they've designated them as a religious, charitable, then they get the exemption. We don't even send them a bill. So it's done on the front end from the property appraisers. Some organizations that are churches, but they're not that way in the property appraiser's office, so they don't get the exemption. So that it's done upstream from that, and it would be a change that we would basically send them a bill, then they wouldn't be exempt.
And then they would have to apply for a hardship if that was what they felt.
We would have to revisit the ordinance and define a hardship. Generally, what we've done, we've tried to streamline that, so if you qualify for other particular county fees and taxes under their hardship guidelines, we've tried to align with that, solid waste and things like that. Generally, it's to your elderly, and it's your lower income. You have to prove you have a certain amount of money in your checking account or income thresholds. And that would not apply to a business, that would not apply, as it currently is written today.
I'd like to see how we could get our budget to match without reducing that one.
Shelley,
Yes, thank you, Mayor.
this one is loud enough for the whole room.
Very good, thank you. I wanted to address this issue because it is at root a legal one. When the city decides to impose a special assessment, there are very particular legal requirements around that, and one of which is you cannot provide exemptions to anyone. It is a fee that's assessed because the services are used. What you can do is what you did for churches and not-for-profits, which is pay it on their behalf. But there couldn't be any sort of hardship exemption application, that type of thing. It's simply you deciding that for certain groups, you think you should pay it on their behalf.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for the input. don't know if it's a fog or a cloud, or I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions out there. We'll try to get a little more focused direction to you before we adjourn today. I first want to start by asking either Mr. Blarski or Mr. Benton to join us for a brief moment. In the numbers that you have been sharing with the commission and the UAB up to this point, I think this goes back to what you called your scorecard, Mr. Blarski. There was an assumption that there would be a $6 million reduction in the general fund transfer, correct?
Correct.
And then the expected rate increase for electric based on that would be 4%.
Correct.
Okay, so if we were to not do the $6 million reduction, if we were to hold it flat or increase it by 1.5%, which I think is a marginal difference, to be honest at this point, is that another percent for rate? Am I remembering my numbers correctly? Would that be a 5% increase in electric rates?
That 6% would get spread over each one of the utilities. 75% would probably go to, 70 to 75% would probably go to the electric side. On the electric side, I think it's somewhere around $1.5 million creates a rate increase. So you'd probably be looking at, and Mark can correct me if I'm wrong, but 2 to 3% increase on the electric side in addition to the 4%.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, it's in the ballpark. It's going to be at least one.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That's all I needed, because I do think that's an important. GRU needs to hear that. If the will of the commission is to hold the general fund transfer flat based on 2019 contributions, then they need to know that. So the next time we have a budget meeting with them, that's what they build in, that instead of 4% rate increase, the 5 to 6% rate increase. That's also something that we need to decide if we're comfortable with. Because I very clearly remember our discussions late last season where there was a lot of anxiety about any rate increases at all. And then how much, and then I know Commissioner Johnson, you have brought up in the past, you would like to look at how we may, and actually it's in our discussion tonight, how we may sort of consistently build in rate increases so we don't have bigger jumps and then lower, sort of like we do our fees. Every 2 years we increase fees 5%, so it's very kind of gradual and expected. What I've heard from 3 of you, or 3.5 of you, is you want to keep the general fund transfer steady. I think Commissioner Ward, you indicated you would be willing to decrease a little bit. So in that case, we need to know what lever we're going to increase on the city side to make up for that. I'm really torn between the two. I'm comfortable using millage for a lot of reasons. It offers us a lot of flexibility. There's no restrictions on what we use that money for, and so regardless of how our priorities shake out, we know that we can fund it through millage. We have had a discussion for several years, and the chief has been part of these with fire assessment. The first year, and I apologize if I'm explaining things y'all already know, but we're getting a lot of information, so it's sometimes good to repeat things. We started the fire assessment out at paying 50% of the cost of fire services. And it's now funding at around 40%, 42%?
45.
Oh, 45, okay. And so we did have a discussion a couple of years ago. It was actually before Commissioner Ward and Mary Ola were on the commission, about having a city policy where we would fund it at 50%, and so there would be an increase in fire assessment to just keep it steady with that. Again, so you don't see these single-time big leaks every 5 to 7 years, which clearly more disruptive for people than, a minor increase on a regular basis. So I'm still comfortable with that. I'm actually comfortable with the 10%. The thing I like about the fire assessment is it directly funds a critical public safety service. It's hard to argue that that's not top priority critical need. And so I am okay with that. I'm okay with going up to 75% on that, actually. I wouldn't be comfortable going any higher than that because I do think you need to keep that buffer in for, in case there's an emergency funding need, things like that. So I do, that's one lever I'm willing to do, the millage I'm willing to do. Just for, Ms. Shalley, do you mind joining us? And while you're coming up here, I'll hit a couple of my other points. I'll just let y'all know that I am going to be asking the commission to consider some specific increments. I'm not going to go through them all today, but one area that I do want us to have a serious discussion about increased funding is with GPD, not necessarily, I want to look at programs that support diversion and deflection and possibly jointly funding some positions that are going to be connected with court services at the county and how we might, it really gets back to our equity goals and our racial disparity targets. And that's going to not be a small amount, I don't think. Plus, I also think that we need to look at, it's not a big number, but doing the signing bonus program that the sheriff's doing. It's kind of hard when the sheriff's doing the signing bonus program and we're not. And we at least think that they should match that. Again, that's not going to be a huge number because that's for new hires, but I'm going to be talking about that. I also want to, we had some conversations that were difficult last year in our contract negotiations with our bargaining units. And there were some comments made at some of those meetings that, yes, we budgeted a certain amount, but we weren't thinking about the union contracts and the collective bargaining process when we did agree as a commission on a budgeted amount for raises. And you see the problem that got us into. We didn't have the money to pay, when it came down to what the commission wanted to do. And so, we ended up making an offer, $500,000 over for fire, $500,000 over, or more than $500,000 over for police. And so that's a discussion that we need to be very intentional about now, that we're going to budget an amount, and that's the amount that we have. And that gives, I think, fair and transparent communication to the bargaining units as well as the situation that we're all in. I also want to definitely avoid a hiring freeze. We have been asking more and more from fewer and fewer people over the last 10 years. And we've had several discussions about morale in different departments, citywide. A huge part of morale is the commission giving our staff the support they need to do the job we're asking them. That's in professional development, that's in compensation, and that's in a workforce that realistically can do the job that we're asking them to do. And so it's tempting, I think, in times like this, because you see we're a personnel-driven organization, so you see your biggest savings in reduced personnel. And that can seem like a good temporary fix, but it creates long-term and systemic problems in the organization because people they're overworked and under-supported. And so I'm very reticent against using things like hiring freezes to do that. Ms. Shalley, in your conversations with other city and county attorneys, have you had any conversations about collection of communication tax on cell numbers? Is that a conversation that's happening right now?
No, not that I can recall.
What would be the mechanism if we were to want to, I mean, do we have the authority to levy that? If we were, what would be the mechanism for identifying and collecting it?
We do some research for
Okay.
you all and report back. So
Okay.
every one of those taxes is a bit different, so I wouldn't want to make any generalizations that weren't accurate.
Okay. Thank you. And that is something that, probably is best pursued through the Florida League of Cities and Florida League of Counties, or Association of Counties, or whatever they're called. Because that's been a challenge, and that's been on their legislative priority list for years. Since I can remember, because that has been an important revenue stream for communities that's just been going away. And so my guess is that it would take a legislative fix, but I don't know. So if Ms. Shalley wants to dig into that a little bit and see if there might be some ways of addressing that, I'm certainly in favor of it. But I wouldn't want us to get our hopes up too much right now, because it seems complicated on how we would identify it and collect it. So, but I'm willing to consider it for sure.
And it is it's very complex, but I know, and I don't know which cities, but they have aggressively pursuing it, and I know that it's common. And you're absolutely right, it's complex because the company may be in Idaho somewhere, the base, and you're utilizing Florida. So it's complex, but it can be done.
Okay. Yeah, it's certainly worth looking at. Okay, thank you, Michelle. So, I hate to do it this way, but our staff does need some direction. Is anybody opposed to our finance staff coming back to us with some scenarios that include increases in millage? I'm not saying we're going to do it, but is anybody opposed to them coming back with scenarios that include a millage increase?
No, show us what the
Okay.
options are.
That's fine. Then is anybody looking to, and this is for GRU, is anybody looking to reduce the general fund transfer by $6 million as presented in GRU budget numbers?
I would like to see what that looks like.
Okay.
Or
So-
3 million. That's
What's
an
that?
option, or 3 million, one of the two.
Okay, so then we would need some scenarios that include a $6 million and a $3 million reduction. And then what that would look like. There's only so much in cuts, which I think we're gonna do anyway. I don't think we get where we're going even with baseline without the cuts that are being suggested. So then what does that 6 million and 3 million look like between millage and fire assessment? Anybody else have any? Yeah.
So here's the thing, we can't commit to one end or the other without seeing the numbers in front of us. So I'm not gonna commit to a middle ground until we can illustrate what both ends look like. I'm not committing to a $6 million cut. I'm not committing to millage rate increases. I'm not committing to rate increases. I need to see what it looks like on paper, what the actual numbers are, to get where we want to go with the services we offer our citizens.
Yeah, and that's fair, but it's just gonna be a marginal difference, Commissioner. When you're talking about a $6 million reduction in the general government budget, we're gonna have to take aggressive action. It's not gonna matter what the property appraiser numbers come back at.
No, I understand that, but I'm saying I need to see what the breadth of numbers are when.
Okay, so those two scenarios. 6, 3, reduction in general fund transfer.
Yep.
And flat. And flat.
And then only using the millage and the fire
1.5%
assessment.
increase.
1.5 million decrease.
Oh, okay, 6, 3, 1.5,
6,
And
3,
even.
1.5, and flat.
yeah.
Sorry, the
And-
1.5 as a decrease?
Yeah,
Okay,
so we're not hearing from anybody a 1.5% increase.
okay.
So
And
flat
I've
would
only
be,
heard use of the millage and the fire assessment.
I don't know what other significant leverage we have
Well,
for
you
that
had
amount of
mentioned that we
money.
may use all the cuts, so I just wanted to clarify that. I thought I heard you just say that.
Well, can you go back to that slide? Certainly, if we're getting into a $9.5 million deficit, we're gonna have to burn through the cuts. I mean, it's just, I don't mean to say that as a declarative statement, but it's hard to imagine that. Yeah, Commissioner Warren?
Can we talk about the fire assessment available for public safety? Are we able to do a police assessment?
No, the way assessments work is, they're in between a tax and a fee, and so you can only levy them on, where you receive a real value to property. It can't be for a service, that's why we
Okay,
can't
it's
turn
less
fire assessment
tangible.
for EMT,
Okay.
type
Speeding
stuff.
tickets doesn't help.
No.
Okay.
In fact, how much, Chief, I don't know, how much of a speeding ticket do we get versus gets mailed out to other organizations like the state? It's a small, we get, it's next to nothing for speeding tickets.
Nothing like Waldo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're no longer.
It's not a reliable revenue source for the city.
Okay. That makes sense. I just had to ask the question.
Yeah, so it's, we can't pay for services through an assessment. And seeing that Michelle's not running up here, whacking me on the back of the head, I think I got it right.
She's comfortable in her chair.
We had that, I mean, back in 2011, we
You look at all
went
those.
deep into that discussion.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, I just wanted to add, we already know the numbers for the millage, so we can really address that today. So we have a $3.5 million deficit on baseline. If we were to cut the GFT by $6 million, that gives us 9.5, so we're probably about 1.6 mils. If we went
For
to-
baseline, no increments.
No increments, correct. So then if we did the 3 million, we've still got the 3.5 million. The 3 million cut to the GFT, so now we're at 6.5 million, so that's about a mil, a little over a mil. And then if we did the 1.5 million cut to GFT, that's $4.5 million deficit, so about 1.25, give or take. So we have that magnitude. So I mean, we're talking anywhere from, at our lowest, the $1.5 million cut, we're talking 1.25 mils. If you're at, wait, did I do that right? No, I did that wrong. No, at 6 million. So if we're at 1.5 million, we're about 3/4 of a mil. I apologize. Because again, we're still going to make up that baseline difference. So we're at 3/4 of a mil all the way up to about 1.5, depending on what you want to do on GFT.
But that's based on millage, that's based on what we had for 2018, is that right? We don't know what we're
That's
having.
That's
property
correct.
value.
Property values, that is correct.
Yeah,
But
okay.
again, we can't count on them, and one of the other cautions on the property tax, while we see all this new property coming in, it has to be on the roll for a year before we start collecting revenue. It has to be on the tax roll, January 1, occupied and ready to go, to be billed in November. So anything that's billed in this upcoming November would have to be occupied actively on the tax roll on January 1st of 19.
But there were quite a
So
few
even if
that
it
were-
comes in February, it's not going to be on the tax roll until the following year. So while I agree 100%, there's lots of construction and lots of new properties, that's the reason we do not.
But there was a
put it
lot
in.
done in 2017. that would be
Absolutely.
on. So-
I agree 100%. But
And
again,
the
I
increased
just,
values has gone up, so, but, and again, so that just comes back to our basic question. How much better is the property tax values
right.
than it was in 2017?
And what we would really do from a staff perspective is, again, get the philosophy. Are you okay with millage or not okay with millage, and what's a bearable rate? we would, like we do every year, we would come to you with what's the maximum millage, and then we get the final numbers in July. The number we present to you mid to late July would reflect those increased property values. We can't wait till July numbers come in to do the budget, because it takes several weeks to do.
And the point I was trying to make is that it's gonna be a marginal difference. It's not gonna be, 1 mil versus 1.5 mils. It's gonna be those 4
In the
digits.
decimals,
I mean,
right.
it's gonna be maybe 0.1 or 0.2 mils difference.
Well, but we've had times where we've looked at it, if we stayed with the same millage, we would get X number of dollars, or we could do even a rollback and then keep the same amount of dollars that came in. So there was enough of a difference for us to have that basic conversation.
Well, last year, because of the Renewable Energy Center. And that was just one giant big item.
Of
But
which
we're not
center?
gonna- The Renewable Energy Center.
Well, that went off the tax roll.
But that was why there was a big movement there.
But we,
So our
Right.
rollback was funky
In
last
best
year.
case scenario, we come back with a better number than we thought. So really what we need to know is just to make sure, I know you want all the scenarios, but if, let's say the commission was wholly opposed to changing millage, that changes our job quite a bit. If you're comfortable looking at, up to 1.5 mils, for example, then we can run all the numbers, give you a proposed budget. Then when July comes, when we get our revised numbers, when we bring it back to you mid to late July, we have something less than what you're comfortable with. So if you're comfortable with 1.5 and the property values come in better, that's great, we may have a lower millage rate. But the thing is, we can't wait until July 1st, or we won't have a budget time for the statutory requirements.
another question then.
Sure.
Did we heard anything about where the county or the school board are in this conversation too? Because that's the impact that really triples after a while.
But the school board can't, they have no flexibility. They're basically told what military they'll charge, they can charge. It's based
So
on
they're already
state
locked.
formula. So they're sort of locked in.
Okay.
County, I have no idea.
Yeah, they're on the same schedule.
They've been in this process of trying to sort of recalibrate their MSTU versus straight millage, and so whether they do that again this year, I don't know, but that could make a difference.
So you're making a proposal to include a consideration to look at the millage, and I'm
Yeah.
supportive of that.
Yeah, just to put it in front of us. I'm gonna have a hard time going above 1 mil. I mean, I'll say that now.
That's helpful.
Yeah,
If that's the
I would
will of the
second
commission,
that.
that's helpful.
That's even high, but I'd say that's a ceiling for me. What was the other thing?
Well, and that will allow us to run the numbers with a maximum mill, so we come back to you and we're discussing increments. That again gives you a reset of the picture so that you can make a decision on those. We'll discuss it next time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The legislature is still in session. Are there any potential bills that may affect our, they talk about tax cuts and things like that. I don't know, are any that could still affect us that are potential that we know of?
We could have to pay $10 million to student government.
I can say to you right now, Mayor and members of the City Commission, it isn't that time where anything can happen because they're negotiating and so I can't tell you that it won't happen, but I can tell you it's that time where everybody's playing sort of bargaining what they want. I will put in a call to Bill today, this afternoon, and find out if there anything that will have an impact on the financial wise. And I'll try to get that before your subcommittee. I'll try to have that probably next week for you, as quickly as I can get it to you.
And that's in, the session ends April 30th, right? Or end of March? Okay. One other area I think I'd like for us to look in terms of revenue is on the parking permits. Maybe those going up more than 5%. I know we're actually having a meeting about mobility and parking tomorrow, I think, the workshop. But some of those areas have very high demand, and the private sector charge is $120, $150 a space. I think we're charging $100 a year or something like that. So, and that's $150 a month. The private sector charge. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
It's amazing, I paid $200 a month for rent for a good decade. We're a pretty nice house. Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. To piggyback off of Commissioner Hayes Santos, I don't remember if we did this last year, but will we be able to get like an update from our lobbyists afterwards? Can we like schedule a time for that to happen? Did we do that last year? I don't remember. We did?
We did.
Okay, yeah, great, thanks.
You can do that. Any other?
Can I just recap what I think I heard?
Yes, please. And if there's some other outstanding things that you want us to give you more clear direction on, please let us know.
Sure, so there seems to be consensus around millage scenarios, with 1 mil being the ceiling that we can come back with. And then on the GFT reduction end, you want to see 6 million, 3 million, 1.5, and flat. All right, that's the consensus areas. And then some of the specific feedback that we heard is to investigate with the Florida League, what other communities are doing about the communications tax, to additionally find out with the passage of the Children's Trust, whether that allows us to reduce in any way our contributions to some of the groups that are currently funded and at what levels. Exclude the fees from the fee proposal increase from the swimming pools, right? Because I think we've done that the last 3 fiscal years.
During the last increase of 5%, we did not increase the fees for pools.
Okay.
So this would be the 4th year.
To look into whether there could be a revenue potential in parking permits. And the other consensus, which may change based on those other scenarios, but for right now, there doesn't seem to be any support for a hiring freeze. So really the 2 areas that I think are some big edits for the finance team is the millage scenarios with the 1 mil max, and then the 6, 3, 1.5, and flat. And then the other ones were individually specific.
So the fire assessment as well.
Fire system. Yes, thank you. Did I leave anyone out?
Very good. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We've got some work cut out for you. Moving along. Okay, members of the public, if you would please come forward to where Ms. Fiore is standing there. State your name for the record, and I will be your clock. So I'll just give you a friendly wave at 1 minute left. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Nathan Scott. It is disappointing that Commissioner Ariola is not here to represent the constituents of District 3 in a city budget meeting where double-digit property tax increases and fire assessment fee increases have been proposed by staff to balance the multi-million-dollar deficits in the city budget. Gainesville City Commission fails to recognize it has an insatiable spending addiction with taxpayer money, and it keeps spending money that it does not have. This is why you have multi-million-dollar budget deficits, Commissioners. Welcome to the economic reality of your failure to govern in a fiscally responsible manner. You've not yet cut a penny of your wasteful discretionary expenditures, catered meals at taxpayer expense and travel, but are quick to talk about raising GRU rates, property taxes, and the fire assessment fees on hardworking Gainesville families. Let's turn to slide 38 of the GFT. Mr. Belarski stated that he would never recommend taking GRU even deeper into debt in the wake of a downgrade with the 2019 Series C bond issuance unless the general fund transfer was cut by at least $6 million. In the classic case of putting the cart before the horse, the 2019 Series C bond issuance was approved before the commitment to reduce the GFT by at least $6 million was obtained by the Gainesville City Commission, or from the Gainesville City Commission. What did GRU tell the credit rating agencies? Did GRU tell the credit rating agencies that GFT was going to be reduced by $6 million if the 2019 Series C bond issuance was approved? Perhaps you need to ask GRU what they actually represented in their slide deck. Perhaps we need to know what investors were told. Let's talk about the GFT proxy on slide 38. IOUs earn a regulatory return on equity. Unlike an IOU, however, GRU's capital structure is approximately 80% debt. Accordingly, the proxy for return on investment should be GRU's cost of debt, which is far lower than the cost of equity, which supports reduction in the general fund transfer. Let's talk about the deficit on slide 40. FY20. $3.4 million projected deficit. FY21 for $2.2 million projected deficit. Let's talk about the utility tax on slide 32. There's a $2.7 million increase that resulted from moving cost recovery of biomass from fuel where it's not taxed over to base rates where it's taxed. That was supposed to go back to the customers. No, you guys used it to expand city government. Let's talk about the millage on slide 29. The city of Alachua and Newberry are not listed. Those would be useful comparisons. So again, I hate to be critical, I know you guys are in a budget crisis, but for hardworking Gainesville families, you guys need to appreciate the peril of your own position, taking a hardline approach on not cutting discretionary expenditures in advance of, a budget discussion, and in advance of our police union doesn't even have a contract, our dedicated officers. I mean, so I'd ask you guys to just take a sharp pencil out, do the right thing, but again, it's disappointing that my commissioner is not here when we're having discussions about double-digit increases to property taxes, fire assessment fees, and multi-year GRD rate increases. That's just unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else wish to speak to us about the budget? Okay, then seeing no further business before us, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.